Blood is not always the anchor that keeps you safe in a storm. Sometimes, it is the suffocating trap slowly closing in on you. For 32 years, I paid for my existence with unacknowledged checks and sacrifices taken for granted. But my family forgot one crucial detail when they ruthlessly exiled me from the estate that night. The person who built the empire is also the one holding the master blueprint to dismantle it piece by piece, and I finally decided to use it. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Arya Hansen. The air outside in the Willamette Valley tasted like wet earth and an impending storm. A violent, freezing rain lashed against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the estate, inside the grand hall. However, it was a suffocating world of blinding crystal chandeliers, gold trimmings, and artificial warmth. Tonight was the grand opening gala for a new luxury craft wine brand. The name on the elegant black labels belonged to my younger brother, Julian Hansen, the golden boy of the family, the newly minted chief executive officer, a title I had silently bought and paid for over the past 10 years. Smooth jazz music hummed through hidden surround speakers. The sharp clinking of imported crystal glasses echoed relentlessly against the high vaulted ceilings. The heavy scent of expensive cologne, roasted venison, and oak barrels hung thick in the air. Flashbulbs from hired photographers popped bright white every few seconds, capturing the illusion of immense success. I stood quietly near the back of the room by a massive floral arrangement. I wore a pristine, custom-tailored white silk dress. I only wanted to blend in. I only wanted to survive the night without an incident. Julian stood right at the center of the room. He held a silver microphone in his left hand and a large glass of our reserve Pinot Noir in his right. His face was flushed red with expensive alcohol and unearned adoration. More than 100 wealthy investors and high society friends hung on his every single word. "They told us it was completely impossible," Julian declared. His arrogant voice boomed over the high-quality speakers, vibrating in my chest. The critics said building a true luxury brand from simple Oregon dirt took 4 or 5 generations, but those people lack vision. They lack the soul for true art. He paused dramatically. He let the well-dressed crowd murmur in polite agreement. Then, his eyes scanned the room and locked directly onto mine. A cruel, lopsided smile slowly spread across his face. Some people simply do not understand the delicate art of creation. Julian continued. Take my lovely older sister, Arya, for example. Scores of heads turned in my direction. Flashbulbs blinded my vision. The massive hall suddenly felt incredibly small and devoid of oxygen. Arya works at Aegis Core Dynamics. Julian sneered into the microphone. A corporate drone, one of those soulless keyboard monkeys punching numbers in a gray cubicle for 80 hours a week. No offense, sis, but you people only know how to calculate risk margins. You do not know how to actually live. You do not know how to build a lasting empire. This estate, this incredible wine, this legacy, it is born from pure, unfiltered passion, my vision, my art. Rich, condescending laughter rippled through the crowd. My chest tightened until it physically hurt. I took one slow, deep breath. I walked directly toward him. The crowd parted like a theatrical curtain. I kept my voice low, calm, tightly controlled. "Julian," I said softly when I reached him, "you have had far too much to drink. Do not push your luck tonight. You are crossing a dangerous line." Before Julian could even open his mouth to answer, a heavy, rough hand slammed onto my shoulder. It was my father, Elias Hansen. He smelled like stale cigars and cheap whiskey masquerading as luxury taste. His face was a terrifying mask of purple fury and drunken rage. "How dare you?" Elias hissed through clenched teeth. His voice was loud, carrying easily to the front rows of guests. "How dare you come into your brother's house and try to ruin his greatest night? You have always been exactly like this. Arya, jealous, bitter. You absolutely cannot stand to see him shine brighter than you. I am not jealous, Dad, I replied. My voice remained perfectly steady despite the pounding in my ears. I am just asking him to keep his speech professional and polite. Professional. Elias barked out a harsh, ugly laugh. He took a threatening step forward. The jazz music seemed to fade away. The entire room fell into a dead, uncomfortable silence. The only sound left was the howling wind beating against the glass windows outside. You think you know better than us because of your little corporate office job? You are nothing but a dark rain cloud hovering over this family. You have spent your entire miserable life trying to poison our joy and drag Julian down. He raised his large wine glass high into the air. The dark red liquid sloshed dangerously over the crystal rim. His eyes burned with decades of unchecked resentment and misplaced pride. You do not belong here. You never did. With a sudden, violent jerk of his wrist, Elias threw his drink directly at me. The freezing liquid hit my chest with a shocking physical force. The dark red wine soaked instantly into my white silk dress. It spread rapidly like an open, bleeding wound across the pristine fabric. The cold liquid dripped down my bare collarbone. It stained my pale skin. Someone in the front row gasped loudly. A glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the hard marble floor. The sharp crack of breaking glass echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Elias pointed a trembling, furious finger toward the massive oak double doors at the entrance. "Get out and never come back," he roared. His voice tore violently through the silent room, echoing off the high ceiling. "Get out!" I stood perfectly still. The wine dripped slowly from my chin onto the floor. I felt the sticky, cold wetness clinging tightly to my skin. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I looked closely at Julian. He was smiling behind his father's back. It was a cowardly, triumphant smirk. I looked at the crowd. They stared back at me with a sickening mixture of pity and disgust. Finally, I looked right into the eyes of Elias. His chest heaved heavily. He looked so incredibly proud of what he had just done. I reached quietly into my small clutch purse. My fingers brushed against the heavy brass master key for the estate gates. I pulled it out. I stepped forward and placed it gently on the nearest glass cocktail table. The metal clinked softly, signaling the end. I gave my father one slow, deliberate nod. Then, I turned my back on all of them. I walked with my head held high past the staring, silent faces. I pushed the heavy oak doors open with both hands. The violent storm greeted me instantly. The freezing Oregon rain hit my face like tiny glass shards. It began washing the red wine from my skin immediately. The heavy doors slammed completely shut behind me, cutting off the bright light and the staring eyes. The noise of the party vanished into nothingness. I was alone in the dark. The final tie was permanently severed. I walked straight to my car. I did not look back. The heavy door of my sport utility vehicle slammed shut, cutting off the howling wind. I sat in the driver's seat and started the engine. The heater blasted warm air over my soaked silk dress, but I did not shiver. The burning sensation in my chest, the one that had choked me inside that grand hall just moments ago, rapidly cooled. It hardened into something sharp, precise, and absolute. The emotional, vulnerable daughter who had desperately sought her father's approval was completely dead. In her place sat the senior director of risk management for Aegis Core Dynamics. Julian had called me a soulless keyboard monkey. He was completely wrong about the monkey part, but he was incredibly right about my soul. When it comes to numbers, I do not have one. I deal in cold, hard data. For 10 long years, I had analyzed, calculated, and mitigated catastrophic failures for some of the largest global corporations. But my greatest, most complex, and most expensive mitigation project had always been my own family. As the freezing rain hammered relentlessly against my windshield, I watched the glowing lights of the estate through the blurred glass. My father truly believed he was the brilliant patriarch of a massive business empire. Julian truly believed his artistic vision had built a luxury brand from nothing. They were both living happily inside a beautifully constructed delusion, a delusion I had entirely financed and maintained. 10 years ago, Elias Hansen was utterly bankrupt. His previous business ventures had failed spectacularly, burying him under a mountain of toxic debt. He was exactly 90 days away from losing the very home he slept in. I was the one who quietly stepped into the shadows to stop the bleeding. I used my massive corporate bonuses, my stock options, and my analytical mind to secretly restructure his liabilities. But I was not foolish enough to hand him cash directly. I am a risk manager. I build firewalls. I created a private, anonymous corporate trust. Through that trust, I purchased the prime Willamette Valley acreage under a shell company name. When Julian wanted to play the role of a master winemaker, I hired the best agricultural scientists to develop the soil and craft the unique fermentation process. Every single asset was legally registered to the trust: the rich soil they stood on, the high-tech irrigation systems, the patent for the wine recipe, the striking logo on the bottle, and the very brand name itself. 100% of the intellectual property belonged to the trust, and I was the sole, uncontested beneficiary and controller of that trust. Julian and my father owned absolutely nothing. They were merely operators. Years ago, I drafted a master licensing agreement that granted their shell management company free, exclusive rights to use the land and the brand. It was a highly generous gift, born from a foolish, lingering hope that they would eventually appreciate me. But every corporate contract has fail-safes. I never deploy a high-value asset without a guaranteed exit strategy. I picked up my phone from the center console. The dashboard clock read 11:45 at night. I scrolled through my encrypted contacts and pressed the name of my private attorney. He picked up on the second ring. "Good evening, Arya," Marcus said. His voice was crisp and alert despite the late hour. "I assume this is not a social call." "It is over, Marcus," I said. My voice was completely flat, entirely devoid of any anger or sorrow. "Execute the termination protocol." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Marcus knew the exact financial history of this arrangement. He knew the immense emotional abuse I had tolerated just to keep the peace. "Are you absolutely certain?" Marcus asked quietly. "Once I file these digital injunctions, the dominoes will fall extremely fast. There is no reversing the initial financial shock." "I am completely certain," I replied without a single second of hesitation. "Invoke Section 4, Paragraph B of the Master Licensing Agreement. Unconditional termination due to severe violation of the Moral Code of Conduct Clause. Revoke all operational licenses, effective immediately." "Understood," Marcus said. I could hear the rapid clacking of a mechanical keyboard through the speaker. "The formal legal notices will be in their inboxes before midnight. Physical copies will be served by private couriers at dawn. What about the physical security of the compound?" "I will handle the perimeter," I said. "Just freeze the capital." I ended the call and opened a secure application on my phone. When Julian had demanded a state-of-the-art security system for the estate, I had my own engineering division at Aegis Corps install it. He thought it was strictly to keep corporate spies out. He never realized it was actually designed to keep him on a tight electronic leash. My fingers flew across the illuminated screen. I bypassed the standard user interface and logged directly into the master administrative override. I selected the main estate, the production facility, and the temperature-controlled storage warehouses. With 3 deliberate taps, I changed every single electronic deadbolt, security alarm code, and biometric scanner. I wiped Julian and Elias from the authorized access list entirely. Next, I opened my private banking portal. I navigated directly to the hidden collateral accounts that secretly backed Julian's massive operational credit lines. I clicked the withdrawal button, moving every single dollar back into my isolated, heavily encrypted holding accounts. The Platinum corporate credit cards, currently sitting in Julian's expensive tailored suit pocket, were now completely worthless pieces of plastic. I looked up at the brightly lit estate one last time. The extravagant party was still going on inside. They were still drinking my wine, standing on my floorboards, celebrating a massive victory they had never actually earned. They had proudly thrown me out of the building. They had no idea they had just thrown themselves out of their entire lives. I shifted the vehicle into drive. I pressed the accelerator and drove slowly down the long, winding asphalt driveway, leaving the glowing, fragile illusion far behind me in the dark. The sun rose over the Portland skyline at exactly 6:15 in the morning. For the first time in my adult life, I did not wake up to the suffocating dread of a family crisis. I sat at the smooth marble kitchen island of my downtown penthouse, wearing a simple silk robe, and opened my encrypted command tablet. The high-resolution screen split instantly into multiple live security camera feeds from the Willamette Valley estate. I watched the dawn of their destruction unfold in glorious, high-definition silence. At precisely 7 o'clock, a sleek black town car pulled aggressively up to the main iron gates of the wine production facility. Julian stepped out into the crisp morning air. He was dressed in a sharp, custom-tailored navy suit, looking every bit the triumphant young billionaire. He was completely ready to give an exclusive, boastful tour to a local lifestyle magazine reporter who sat waiting in the passenger seat of the luxury car. Julian strode confidently to the metal security keypad and swiped his gold-trimmed access card. A bright red light flashed rapidly on the scanner. Access denied. Julian frowned, wiped the card on his expensive jacket, and swiped it a second time. Red light. He gritted his teeth and began aggressively mashing his personal, customized identification code into the numbered pad. Red light, red light, red light. I watched closely as his deep confusion rapidly warped into furious indignation. He kicked the heavy iron gate with his polished leather shoe. Suddenly, two massive men in tactical black uniforms stepped out from the fortified guardhouse. They did not wear the soft, branded white polo shirts of the winery's usual hospitality staff. They were heavily armed operatives from Aegis Corps Private Security, my personal contractors. I could not hear the audio feed, but the hostile body language was incredibly loud and clear. The lead security officer held up a thick, laminated legal injunction and pointed a stern, unyielding finger back toward the public highway. Julian waved his arms frantically, his face turning an ugly shade of purple. He pointed repeatedly at his own chest, clearly shouting that he was the chief executive officer of the brand. The security guard simply crossed his massive arms, widened his stance, and shook his head once. The strict mandate was absolute. The Hanson family was permanently banned from the premises. "You are trespassing." The guard's posture said, "Leave immediately, or you will be physically removed." 10 miles away, inside the sprawling master bedroom of the grand estate, my father was experiencing his own devastating personal earthquake. I did not need a hidden camera to see the fallout. The digital, time-stamped, red receipts from Marcus, my corporate attorney, told the entire miserable story. At exactly 7:30, Elias Hansen opened his morning emails, a high priority. Flagged message from the Central Mortgage Bank sat ominously at the top of his inbox. Due to the sudden, authorized withdrawal of all my collateral backing, his massive mansion, the very bed he was waking up in, was no longer his safe fortress. It was now an active, immediate foreclosure zone. Attached directly below the bank notice was the formal, unbending legal mandate from Marcus. The document was completely void of any familial warmth or emotional language. It coldly demanded the complete and total vacating of the property premises within 30 days. There would be no extensions. There would be no backroom negotiations. The luxury estate rightfully belonged to the private trust, and the trust was ruthlessly seizing its physical asset. The fragile illusion of his immense wealth and patriarchal power evaporated into thin air before he could even finish his morning cup of coffee. My personal cellular phone, resting on the marble counter next to me, began to vibrate violently. It danced erratically across the smooth stone, buzzing like an angry hornet. I ignored it. It stopped for 3 seconds, then immediately started ringing again. A new voicemail notification popped brightly onto the screen, then another, then 5 more. By 8 in the morning, I had registered exactly 42 missed calls. I tapped the speakerphone icon and played the most recent audio message from Julian. The pristine digital audio filled my quiet, sunlit kitchen. "Arya, pick up the phone right now," Julian screamed into the receiver. His voice was completely stripped of the arrogant, condescending drawl from the night before. It was painfully high-pitched, cracking wildly with raw, unadulterated terror. "You have to fix this right now. The main gates are completely locked. The corporate bank accounts are showing absolute zero balances, and the investors, Arya, the private investors are calling me. They are not exactly who I told everyone they were." I leaned back in my comfortable chair and listened closely. I already knew exactly what he was about to confess. I am a senior risk manager. I read every single line of his highly questionable, fraudulent bookkeeping 6 months ago. "They are shadow lenders. Arya." Julian babbled frantically on the recording, his breath hitching audibly in his throat. "Ruthless subprime debt brokers, violent loan sharks wearing custom-tailored suits. I took an $8 million cash advance from them because the traditional corporate banks completely refused to expand my credit lines. They wanted tangible, real collateral. I told them we fully owned the land. I told them the entire estate was the ironclad guarantee, but they just pulled the public county records after seeing some terrible rumor online about our accounts freezing this morning. They know the anonymous trust owns the land. They know I have absolutely nothing to my name. They explicitly said, if I do not wire the entire $8 million back into their offshore accounts by 5 o'clock this evening, they are going to come to the house and take it out of my physical flesh. Arya, please, I am begging you. Dad is having severe chest pains. Mom is crying hysterically on the living room floor. Pick up the damn phone." The frantic voicemail ended with a sharp, digital click. The heavy, desperate silence of his absolute panic contrasted beautifully with the serene, untouched quiet of my apartment. Another incoming call flashed brightly on the screen. This time it was my mother, the very woman who had stood silently by the expensive floral arrangements last night, watching her husband throw red wine on her oldest daughter without saying a single word of defense or comfort. I reached out slowly and pressed the side volume button down, sliding the mobile device into absolute silent mode. I turned the glowing glass screen face down against the cool, hard marble. I walked casually over to my stainless steel espresso machine. I carefully ground the fresh, dark roasted coffee beans. The rich, earthy, comforting aroma quickly filled the bright room. I locked the heavy portafilter securely into place and watched the thick golden brown liquid pour perfectly into a small, white ceramic cup. Far below my high-rise window, the busy city was waking up. Cars moving like tiny rushing ants along the steel bridge. Thousands of people hurrying to their highly stressful, complicated lives. But up here, the air was perfectly clean. The ambient temperature was flawlessly controlled. I raised the ceramic cup to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter, boiling hot coffee. I closed my eyes and let the absolute, profound tranquility wash over my tired shoulders. It was my very first entirely peaceful morning in more than 10 long years. A violent, destructive storm was currently raging miles away, tearing down the rotten, hollow house they had proudly built. But I was finally safely indoors, warm and entirely out of their reach. The concrete floors of the Aegis Core Dynamics underground parking facility echoed with the sharp clicking of my low heels. It was exactly 6:45 in the evening. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting long, stark shadows across the empty concrete. I was walking confidently toward my assigned executive parking space when a trembling shadow stepped out from behind a massive concrete pillar. It was my mother, Margaret Hansen. She looked drastically different from the poised, diamond-draped woman standing proudly by the extravagant floral arrangements just 24 hours ago. Her expensive makeup was severely smudged. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and she wore a frantic, desperate expression perfectly calibrated to elicit immediate guilt. "Arya, please," she sobbed, rushing forward to grab my forearm with both of her shaking hands. "You have to stop this absolute madness. You are completely destroying our family. I looked down at her hands gripping my coat, then up into her tear-filled eyes. For the first 20 years of my life, those tears would have utterly shattered my resolve. I would have instantly surrendered my personal boundaries, my money, and my peace of mind to stop her from crying. But I had spent the last decade analyzing human behavioral patterns. I immediately recognized this deeply ingrained tactic. It was not genuine sorrow. It was a calculated emotional extraction. It was the desperate maneuvering of a woman who was terrified of losing her comfortable lifestyle. "Let go of my arm, Mother," I said evenly. My voice remained perfectly flat, echoing coldly off the concrete walls. She recoiled slightly but immediately shifted into her secondary offensive strategy. She played the sacred bond of blood. "How can you be so incredibly cold?" she cried out, her voice breaking dramatically. "We are your flesh and blood. He is your own father. Arya Julian is your baby brother. We raised you. We put food in your mouth for 18 years. You cannot just throw your own family away over one silly, drunken mistake." A silly, drunken mistake. I repeated the words slowly, tasting the absolute toxicity of her phrasing. "Mother," he threw a glass of red wine at my chest in front of 100 wealthy people and told me to get out forever. "And what exactly did you do?" "You stood there in complete silence. Just like you stood in complete silence when they took my entire college fund to pay off Julian's massive gambling debt 7 years ago. Just like you stood in complete silence when Dad called me a useless corporate drone every single Thanksgiving for the past 10 years. Your silence was a deliberate choice. Your silence was absolute complicity." "I had to keep the peace," she wailed, fresh tears spilling rapidly down her cheeks. "You know exactly how your father gets when he is angry. I am just a mother trying desperately to keep her family together." "You did not want a daughter," I replied softly, pressing the button to unlock my car door. "You wanted a human shield. You wanted someone to absorb the heavy blows so you could continue living in a comfortable, luxurious mansion without ever having to face the ugly truth about the men in your house. I am officially resigning from that position." I stepped into my vehicle, closed the heavy door, and drove away. I watched her in my rearview mirror, standing entirely alone in the dim garage. The guilt-tripping had completely failed. The toxic dynamic was finally starved of its primary oxygen source. But a trapped animal is highly unpredictable. At exactly 9:30 that night, an urgent red notification flashed across my mobile phone screen. A silent alarm had been tripped at my private downtown residence. I pulled my car over to the side of the quiet street and opened the live security application. The high-definition night vision camera in my home office showed a frantic, sweating figure tearing furiously through my locked filing cabinets. It was Julian. He had somehow bypassed the building concierge and used a heavy steel pry bar to force open my secondary service door. He was desperately throwing thick paper folders onto the hardwood floor, frantically searching for the original paper trust documents. In his severely panicked, uneducated mind, he truly believed that destroying physical pieces of paper would somehow magically erase an encrypted, multi-million-dollar legal firewall. I did not call my private security team this time. I dialed the public emergency dispatch. When I arrived at my building 15 minutes later, 2 marked police cruisers were already parked out front, their blue and red lights flashing brightly against the glass facade. I rode the elevator up to my floor alongside 3 uniformed officers. We walked into my apartment and found Julian entirely trapped inside my office. He was clutching a handful of utterly useless tax receipts, his face pale with absolute terror as the officers drew their weapons and ordered him to freeze. "Arya, tell them," Julian shouted, dropping the papers instantly as the officers forcefully pushed him against the wall to secure his wrists in heavy steel cuffs. "Tell them, this is just a stupid misunderstanding. I am your brother. I was just looking for some family documents. Tell them not to arrest me." The lead police sergeant turned to me with a questioning look. "Ma'am, do you wish to press formal criminal charges for breaking and entering?" I looked deeply at Julian. His eyes were wild, begging me to play my old, familiar role, the silent fixer, the eternal savior who would clean up his mess one more time. No, I said calmly to the sergeant. Julian let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. A smug, deeply familiar smirk briefly flashed across his sweaty face. He thought he had won. He truly believed the blood tie had saved him again. I am not pressing charges for the simple break-in, I continued, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, firmly bound dossier. However, I would like to officially report a major federal felony. I am a senior director of risk management, and I have uncovered extensive, undeniable financial fraud. I handed the heavy file directly to the police sergeant. Julian's brief smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. Inside that folder, I stated clearly, ensuring every single officer heard me, is absolute, irrefutable proof of grand larceny and wire fraud. For the past 24 months, Julian Hansen has systematically forged digital signatures to illegally siphon exactly $1,500,000 from the private retirement and pension accounts of Elias Hansen. The funds were absolutely not used for business operations. The bank routing numbers and photographic evidence inside clearly prove the money was entirely diverted to offshore gambling syndicates, luxury yacht rentals, and illicit private entertainment. The room fell completely silent. The only sound was the heavy, ragged breathing coming from Julian's throat. He was entirely paralyzed. You see? I looked directly into Julian's terrified eyes. I monitor every single financial transaction in this family. Dad thought his retirement money was safely locked away in high-yield government bonds. He had absolutely no idea his brilliant golden boy was quietly bleeding his entire life savings completely dry just to play the role of a rich playboy. The police sergeant flipped slowly through the first few pages of the meticulously highlighted bank statements. He saw the forged signatures. He saw the massive offshore wire transfers. He nodded firmly to the other officers. They tightened their grip on Julian's arms and immediately began reading him his legal rights. Julian did not fight back. He simply stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. The grand illusion of his artistic genius was entirely dead. The golden boy was officially a documented, miserable thief. By midnight, the explosive truth had reached the Willamette Valley estate. The unholy alliance between the arrogant father and the spoiled son shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Elias, realizing his beloved boy had stolen every single penny of his personal safety net, immediately turned against him. According to the late-night emails from my lawyer, Elias spent the entire night screaming into the telephone, frantically trying to file his own separate criminal charges against Julian to save his own skin from the ruthless debt collectors. They were no longer directing their venom at me. Stripped of my money and my protection, the family unit was completely dead. They were now furiously tearing each other apart, fighting fiercely over the miserable scraps of their ruined empire. The heavy glass door of Marcus's downtown law firm closed silently behind me, sealing us inside the soundproof conference room. It was exactly 2:00 in the afternoon on a rainy Tuesday. The polished mahogany table stretched across the center of the room like a vast, cold ocean dividing two warring nations. On one side sat my family. They looked completely unrecognizable. Julian sat slumped in his leather chair, freshly released on a heavily restricted bail. He wore a wrinkled gray sweater, his eyes hollow and darting nervously around the room. My mother sat next to him, gripping a crumpled tissue, her face pale and drawn. And then there was Elias. Despite the absolute devastation of the past 48 hours, my father still clung desperately to his hollow pride. He sat perfectly straight, his jaw clenched, wearing a faded but clean suit. He was determined to play the injured patriarch to the very bitter end. "This entire mediation is a complete farce," Elias announced loudly the moment I took my seat across from him. His voice echoed harshly against the silent glass walls. He pointed an accusatory finger directly at my face. "You think you are so incredibly clever, Arya. You think you can use your slippery corporate lawyers to steal my life's work. I built that brand with my own two bare hands. I poured my blood and sweat into that soil. I am taking you to the highest court in this state. I will sue you for every single penny you have, and I will take back my rightful empire." I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a single word of defense. I looked at Marcus, who gave me a slow, solemn nod. I reached down to the floor and lifted my heavy leather briefcase onto the polished mahogany table. The brass locks clicked open with a sharp, echoing snap. "You did not build an empire, Dad," I said quietly. My voice was calm, almost a whisper, yet it commanded the entire room. "You built a massive, hollow theater set, and I was the one paying the electricity bill to keep the stage lights on." I pulled out the first massive, firmly bound folder and slid it slowly across the smooth table. It stopped exactly inches from Elias's folded hands. "Open it," I commanded softly. Elias sneered, but his trembling fingers flipped the heavy cover open. "That is the absolute truth about your golden boy," I stated, staring coldly at Julian, who visibly shrank into his chair. "Those are the original, certified bank receipts from exactly 7 years ago, when Julian told you he needed seed money for a brilliant tech startup. He was actually sitting at high-stakes poker tables in underground casinos. I paid exactly $450,000 to keep a violent loan syndicate from breaking both of his legs. Every single transaction, every single digital wire transfer, signed and authorized by my personal accounts, is documented right there." My mother let out a sharp, pathetic gasp. Elias stared at the numbers, his eyes scanning the endless pages of indisputable financial proof. He swallowed hard, but his stubborn pride refused to break. "Families help each other," Elias muttered defensively, his voice losing a fraction of its booming volume. "That does not negate the incredible work I did for the winery." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the second heavy folder. I pushed it across the table. It landed on top of the first one with a heavy, suffocating thud. "This is your heart," I said. Elias froze completely. "Exactly 5 years ago, you suffered a massive cardiac event," I continued, my voice as sterile and precise as a surgical scalpel. "You told the entire extended family that your premium health insurance covered the best private surgeons in the state. That was a complete and total lie. You had let your health insurance lapse completely because you spent the premium money on a vintage sports car, the life-saving quadruple bypass surgery, the 6 weeks of intensive care, the specialized rehabilitation clinic. It cost a total of $825,000. The hospital was going to place a medical lien on the house. I paid the entire bill in cash. I bought the very heartbeat inside your chest." The room grew incredibly heavy. The air conditioning hummed faintly in the background. My mother buried her face in her hands, sobbing silently. Julian stared blankly at the tabletop. Elias's hands began to shake violently. He tried to push the folder away, as if the physical paper was burning his skin. "And finally," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register, I pulled out the third and thickest folder. It was entirely black. I placed it gently in the exact center of the table. "The absolute foundation of your so-called legacy." Elias stared at the black folder. The last remaining color drained rapidly from his face. He knew exactly what it was. 9 years ago," I said, making sure my eyes locked directly onto his terrified gaze, "the Federal Revenue Service began a massive audit of your previous construction business. They found severe, deliberate tax evasion. They were preparing a criminal indictment that carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 to 15 years in federal prison. You were going to be locked in a cage. Dad, you begged me to fix it. I hired a team of elite forensic accountants. I paid millions of dollars in severe federal penalties, back taxes, and exorbitant legal fees to keep you completely out of prison. That is why you were utterly bankrupt. That is why I had to create the anonymous trust to buy the vineyard land. Because you were a convicted financial risk, completely uninsurable and totally unbankable." I leaned back in my chair and looked at the 3 massive piles of paper. They represented a decade of my stolen youth, my endless stress, and my unacknowledged sacrifice. "You never built an empire," I repeated, the truth hanging in the air like a heavy executioner's blade. You never poured sweat into the soil. You poured my money into a bottomless pit of your own ego. I bought your freedom. I bought your health. I bought your son's safety. I bought the dirt you walked on. You own absolutely nothing. The silence that followed was absolute and devastating. It was not the dramatic, screaming silence of a sudden argument. It was the crushing, suffocating silence of a complete reality collapse. There were no more lies left to tell. There were no more delusions to hide behind. The heavy, lifeless papers on the table had brutally stripped away every single layer of their manufactured greatness. Elias slowly lowered his head. His broad shoulders caved inward. The arrogant patriarch who had proudly banished me into the freezing rain was completely gone. In his place sat a broken, hollow, utterly defeated old man, finally crushed under the massive, undeniable weight of the truth. The crushing weight of the absolute truth finally shattered the last remaining fragments of my father's manufactured pride. For a long, agonizing moment, Elias simply stared at the black folder. Then, a strange, suffocating sound escaped his throat. It was a ragged, high-pitched gasp of pure panic. The imposing patriarch, the man who had ruled our family with an iron fist and a booming voice, suddenly collapsed forward. He slid out of his heavy leather chair and dropped directly onto his knees on the cold, polished floor of the conference room. "Arya, please," Elias wept. The tears streamed freely down his aging face, completely stripping away decades of toxic arrogance. His voice was entirely broken, reduced to the terrified pleading of a desperate child. "I am so incredibly sorry. I was wrong. I am nothing without that estate. I do not know how to run a business. I do not know how to build anything. Please, I am begging you on my hands and knees. Take back the legal notices. Give us the property back. Do not leave us with nothing." My mother covered her face, sobbing uncontrollably at the pathetic sight of her husband on the floor. Julian turned his head away, too ashamed to even look. I sat perfectly still, looking down at the man who had thrown me out into the freezing rain. I felt no triumphant joy. I felt no burning vindictiveness. I only felt a profound, exhausting emptiness finally beginning to heal. "I cannot do that. Dad," I said quietly, my voice gentle but entirely unyielding. "I am not withdrawing the asset recovery mandates. The estate, the brand, and the land are permanently returning to the trust. If I rescue you from this consequence, you will never learn. You will simply find another way to rebuild your beautiful delusion." Elias let out a devastated wail, his head bowing toward the floorboards. "However," I continued, signaling for Marcus to hand me a final, single sheet of paper, "I am officially signing a legal waiver regarding the past debts. I will not pursue civil litigation to force you to repay the medical bills, the legal fees, or Julian's gambling debts. I am completely writing off millions of dollars. You are entirely free of those specific financial obligations to me. It is a clean slate. You will have to start over from the absolute bottom, but you will not be dragged into court by your own daughter." I stood up, leaving the massive stacks of evidence on the table. I walked out of the glass room, leaving them to their own reckoning. The fallout over the next several weeks was severe, brutal, and completely grounded in reality. Stripped of his corporate shield, Julian had to face his furious creditors completely alone. He was forced to officially declare Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The luxurious tailored suits were permanently replaced by a neon safety vest to avoid total starvation and pay his court-mandated restitution. My golden brother took a minimum wage job as a heavy cargo loader at a local shipping warehouse. My mother, who had not worked a single day in 40 years, had to learn how to operate a computerized cash register as a checkout clerk at a discount supermarket. They were finally living the exact, unfiltered reality they had earned. Exactly 6 months later, a small, unmarked envelope arrived at my penthouse. I recognized the sharp, aggressive handwriting immediately. It was from Elias. I opened it slowly. There was no long, manipulative essay. There were no empty, meaningless apologies attempting to win his way back into my wallet. There was only a single, folded piece of lined paper with one handwritten sentence. I was completely wrong and you were completely right. I stood by my living room window, looking out over the bright, vibrant city. I held the note in my hand for a few quiet moments. Then, I walked into the kitchen, turned on the gas stove, and held the corner of the paper to the blue flame. I watched the fire consume the words, dropping the ashes into the stainless steel sink. I did not burn it out of lingering hatred. I burned it because I had truly, completely let it go. I did not need his apology to survive. I did not need his validation to know my own worth. Later that afternoon, I packed a small overnight bag, got into my car, and drove away from the city. I merged onto the westbound highway, heading straight toward the open ocean. The late afternoon sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of gold and orange. I rolled the windows down, letting the fresh, salty wind rush through my hair. A genuine, unburdened smile spread across my face. I had lost a deeply toxic family, but in the ashes of their ruined empire, I had finally found my own life. I learned the most vital lesson of all. Setting a firm boundary is never an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-respect. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Maya Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next story.